Hello and welcome to another video of the Talking About Testing channel. My name is Valmir and today I'm here with David Burns. How are you doing, David?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing very good as well. So this is a video that is going to the English chat playlist here of the Talking About Testing channel. I had the pleasure of meeting David in person last year at TestJS Summit. I also attended his workshop recently, and I really like the work David is doing. So, first of all, I would like if you could introduce yourself, and then we can move on with some questions that I have prepared for you there.
Cool. Hello, I'm David. I am the head of the open source program office at BrowserStack, which is a cloud testing tool. I am the chair of the W3C's browser testing and tools working group, so standardizing how people go about testing tools and things like that to make their lives easier. I worked at Mozilla for a long time. I've been at BrowserStack for 4 years. I've worked on Selenium for 15 years plus, and been working on Nightwatch.js, which is um, a JS test runner that sits on top of Selenium for the last 3 years. So
In terms
I've
of
been
your
around.
contributions to Selenium, to which language have you contributed to?
So I contributed to the JavaScript bindings, and I got did a lot of work on the Python bindings, getting them into Scratch. I did that while I was at Mozilla because Mozilla is kind of a Python and JavaScript shop.
Yeah,
I was also my team created Gecko Driver, which is the way WebDriver drives Firefox. My team also got the initial implementation of Puppeteer into Firefox going. So
nice.
yeah, so I've kind of been around.
So nowadays Puppeteer supports more than just Chrome. I didn't know that. Because I remember Puppeteer was Chrome only when it was launched.
Yeah, so yeah, it was because it heavily relies on the Chrome debug protocol, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, browsers the one thing that they can never agree on is how debuggers should work inside a browser. And
Mhm.
so Chrome has their opinion, Mozilla has their opinion, Apple and the WebKit group have their opinion with Web Inspector, and the way they all speak into the browser is very different. And so
I see.
it was trying to simplify that. My predecessor in the W3C, who used to chair the group, he used to work at Opera, and like his goal was to get WebDriver specified and a debugger protocol specified, but no one wanted to get the debugger protocol specified.
Yeah, I see. So
So
to get started with our conversation here, the first question I want to ask you is: more than once uh, I heard you quote someone saying that you should write just one end-to-end test, and I understand that this is more of a mindset, not a strict rule.
yeah.
So how do we? I want to hear more about this, and maybe hear about how do we select the best end-to-end test to write, and if you have any like real examples to share with us of like real projects that you have worked on where you have selected like just a very small group of end-to-end tests to write.
So the quote is from Simon Stewart, who's the original creator of WebDriver. And he did it in the State of the Union talk. If memory serves, 2016. It was a Selenium conference in London,
Mm.
and he said that I want you, like, when you're writing Selenium tests, you should only ever write one. And
Hmm.
as you said, like, it's not about the one, but it's about the mindset, right?
Yeah.
Because um, when we look at the basic, if we go back to basics, right, the idea of the testing pyramid is that your end-to-end tests should be at the top of the pyramid, and there should be fewer and fewer of them, right?
Yeah.
um, and so, like, the idea there is that, like, focus in on what is important, because when you get to the top of the pyramid, it's highly likely that those tests are going to be incredibly flaky,
Mm.
right? And especially if you there's a certain movement to only support one browser in testing. because they go, oh, at least I know how this one browser is going to work, right? But in
Yeah.
reality, if you start supporting Safari and you start supporting Firefox on top of Chrome, that's where the real flakiness generally comes in. So it's about trying to minimize that. And so for me, like when it comes to how would you pick that one test or kind of the one group of tests,
Yep.
the main thing for me is about focusing on what is the area that's going to impact you the most if it went down.
Yeah.
So what's the highest risk area, right? So like I know The Guardian, for example, they use a lot of Selenium tests, but the one area that they never use Selenium tests or anything like that is on their payments page, because they've
Mm.
got everything around payments so monitored and things like that. If they suddenly noticed no one was buying stuff, they could roll back quite quickly through monitoring, not through testing.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a case of like, how do you get the feedback loops into a meaningful shape, right? Because testing is just it's
Yeah.
part of your
Testing is
feedback.
just part of getting feedback, as monitoring could be as well, right?
Exactly. And so it's like, how do you get your feedback loops to be super fast
Mm.
and meaningful? And
Yeah.
so from there you go, right, my one test could be, actually my one test could just be the login test, right? For example, right? Because it, like to me, a login test tests the browser through so many different things,
Mm.
especially if you go, right, I need to go from an HTTP URL and I need to do a login, because then you need to know that like redirects are working, because it has to go to HTTPS. There's potential for third-party plugins being inserted for logins, right? How do you deal with those? And so there's lots of things, but so it's more kind of where's the area of highest risk and with the least amount of like potential feedback loops around it.
Yeah.
That's where that one test should be, and then
Yeah.
everything else you try kind of fit in with like component testing, integration test, and API testing, and go from
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, at this exact moment, I am working on a web project for a course that I'm gonna give to some of my students in May 2024. And I've been trying to follow this rule where I have written the API tests for it already, and I'm in the process of writing. I have a few unit tests as well. I'm in the process of writing component tests for the front end, and I'm probably gonna leave just a few for the end-to-end part. And I think this is very aligned with what you have just said. Yeah, and another thing that came to my mind when you were speaking as well, you mentioned about like the different browsers bringing the flakiness into place. It reminded me the time I worked for whereby.com, the tool we are using to chat at the moment. And this is a tool that rely on WebRTC, real-time communication. That is an implementation that runs inside the browser. So it was super important for us to test cross-browser because different browsers implement WebRTC differently. They have different codecs for encoding and decoding video and audio. And I remember that like at least half of the tests that we would see failing would be because of differences in the browser implementation. So, and not only that, like we had to, because we depended so much on the browser implementation, we had to test not only on stable versions of browsers, but also on beta versions of browsers because they will become stable
Mm-hmm.
versions very soon. So I think that you pointed out something very important as well.
As a kind of, I know this is going off on a tangent. When I was working at Mozilla, one of my core responsibilities was around interoperability. So how do you make sure that browsers are interoperable with each other?
That's exactly what we called it, interoperability testing.
Yeah, and WebRTC, I can tell you now, was the biggest area of pain for
Mm.
everyone. Um, and like the Googlers are not going to like it, but it was mostly because they never followed the specifications. right? They have their own opinions on what a specification should be, right? And
Yeah.
with through the W3C, and we see this. I see this as a lot as a chair. Is kind of the idea is that you should have collaboration, and collaboration then leads to consensus, and consensus leads to a good product, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to like good examples of that, if you're a front end developer, is FlexGrid. FlexGrid, when it came to CSS, was great collaboration and then a great implementation. All the browsers got it all at the same time. It was fantastic. If you look at WebRTC and web components, that's just the area of like pain and hate that kind of like Chrome went off in one direction, never wanted to collaborate, or when people said, well, actually, we could do it better this way, they're like, no, but we've already implemented it. So just deal with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I've
There's
been
a
there and done that.
That's nice to hear. I was not alone then. It was kind of at the same time that it was hard. It was a nice experience because testing that audio and video is going through and that screen sharing works and that you can like communicate through different browsers was a very nice and unique thing that I have to have done in my career. So it was a nice experience. Now changing gears a little bit, I don't remember exactly why I wrote this question, but um, I think it was. I don't remember if it was during the workshop or somewhere else. But I came to this idea that I wanted to ask you about HTML test reports. So, what are your thoughts on this kind of reports for testing versus just the report in the command line as you have when you run the test on CI? We have this kind of spec reports that render the report of a test in the browser with the description, the stack trace if the test fails, screenshots, and this kind of thing. Is it worth focusing on building these reports, or would it be better to focus on building a high quality software? Why I'm saying all that, I have created a video here on my YouTube channel. It's in Portuguese though, which is I say that I don't write this kind. I don't mind putting effort on this kind of reports because what I care is on having very high quality software, and what I care is that the tests are always green, and if they fail we immediately stop what we are doing and we fix the tests. And if the tests are always green, I don't see any point in having HTML test reports. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the value, like you're correct, the value in reports is negligible if everything's always passing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The great value comes in, and it's a case by case basis, right? So like if you've got like extreme examples of CI/CD pipelines where like Mozilla, when I was there, when I left, and that was 4 years ago, the CI, you make a commit, depending on this, what it was changing, could kick off 2,500 compute hours worth of building and testing.
Wow.
Um, and so, like, that's obviously not all the time, but it's dependent. And like some of
Mm-hmm.
it's for like making sure it works on mobile, whatever. And for those cases, like when you got something like that, an HTML report is kind of worthless because like you're potentially generating hundreds of these just for one commit because like how you splice them up. Where the value I think comes in is when things are going horribly wrong, and then you can have a way of visualizing how failures are.
Yeah.
Because like a lot of us, we
As far as you take action, right?
yeah, exactly. So like for me, I'm like I like to visualize how something is going. Like I don't have a good internal visualization. So if someone said, "Close your eyes, can you see this thing?" Like all I see is black, right? But I
Yeah.
like I've tried to imagine what that could be, but like I can't actually physically see it. Where having the reports sometimes is actually quite useful. The other side of it is that some managers kind of just feel that they need to be able to hand over something tangible to like clients and whatever and go, hey, here's this. Look, everything's green, right? And you can see how it's going and all of that. And that's that tangible thing that I think some people see value in. And I think it's definitely a case by case value. But like for me, especially like with Nightwatch, I know WebDriver O has got something similar. Cypress has got something similar. Playwright's got something similar, right? Like there's no real differentiation in the space at the moment.
Mm.
Is that when it goes wrong, you have a way of like breaking it down, being able to step through like command by command and saying, oh, I can see at this point it was the DOM was this shape and I can visualize it, right? Because I can render it. And so you can see it. And I think that's where the great value of HTML is. But like if it's always green, just throw them
Yeah.
away type of thing.
Yeah. So, and would you agree that maybe so you have a problem, you have lots of your tests failing, and then you have an HTML report that can allow you to visualize the problem you are having, and then you decide you are going to take some action, and then you do take the action, you make your test suite reliable. Would it be okay to retire the HTML report afterwards?
Yeah, yeah, like yeah, because unless they okay, no,
Because
I'm going to take this back.
what I see is many times is people wanting to write the reports to show to management just
Yeah,
because they were asked to. They don't think about like what should I do to make the management happy. Wouldn't be showing them a report, but a very high quality software, right?
yeah. So the there is a point where I think you should keep them. Like especially if you've gone through a cycle of like quality. Well, you're calling it as quality dips. I'm saying I'm going to call it tests failed, right? The
Okay.
tests start failing, and having that kind of reference point beforehand and the reference point after can be quite good because it's a way that you could bisect, right? You can go, well, this
Hmm.
is what was happening here, this was what was happening here, and I can kind of see the degradation of everything at that point.
Yeah.
Do you keep it infinitely? No. Like I think maybe possibly a month or something less, depending on your needs. But
Hmm.
but that's where it actually becomes kind of useful. Is that if you're going through the cycle of like the flakiness is increasing or decreasing,
Yeah.
then you have a way of like tracking it because then you can like see what's happening,
Yeah.
and especially like for example, one of the things that we're working through at the moment with Nightwatch is like React has got a way of storing information, like extra information. And if you try clear like an input, it'll clear it. And then the minute you take focus away, it'll just put the data back in. And it only seems to be happening with React. So like I think the bug is in React and it only seems to be happening in Chrome. I
Hmm.
was like, oh, okay. And so having that ability to go, well, here's this thing when it was working, here's this thing when it wasn't working, and you can visualize that. That's where like the true value of those reports comes in.
Hmm.
But if everything's always green, then the value drops like very quickly, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
it all depends on kind of what cycle you're going through at the moment.
Yeah. And what I believe also is that you should always be trying to get better of how you do things, meaning that at some point it will just make sense to retire the test reports because you don't want to do the thing you were doing the same way again and again. Like you want to improve the way you work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about career advancement for a bit. Do you think it's safe to focus like this channel here? The majority of the audience are QAs, quality assurance engineers, testers, and that kind of role. Do you think it's safe to focus only on test automation for this kind of people, or is it better to approach QA as any other software engineering role and focus on helping teams deliver faster without compromising quality, building tools for development teams to consume, assisting companies to reduce costs, etc.? Or is it okay just to, I'm gonna just do automation, this is what I like to do, and that's it?
Personally, I would hope that people would tend towards being the latter, right? So
Hmm.
test automation is software development,
It
despite what
is.
a number of software developers will tell you. They'll go, no, that's testing. It's like, no, actually, I'm writing code, therefore I'm a developer. You can
Yeah.
pretend it's not, but the reality is that it is. Um, and so with that mindset, we also have the quality is everyone's responsibility, right? Testers don't find like don't create bugs, right? The bugs were always there. They just
Hmm.
surface them to everyone in the team. And so testers like QAs, no matter what they are, they should always have the agency, the kind of the ability to go in and go, I need to make this change because it will help my job with automation. And so if they need to go make changes on the front end, they should definitely have the agency to go do that because everyone benefits from that. Because like if they've made the application more testable and then other people see it, they go, oh, actually, next time I do this change, I'll add this thing because I know it'll make my code more testable.
Mm.
And they start moving through that. Um, I know there's the whole shift left philosophy that is happening in a lot of companies, and a lot of companies are taking it slightly too far in that they'll go, well, we don't need testers at the moment. I still think people will still need testers,
Hmm.
but we don't need the kind of like when I started my career, I think there was like a 2-to-1 ratio in some big tech companies like Microsoft, right? 2 developers to 1 QA. Who were going through things. And so I don't think it needs to be that extreme, but I still think you need that other person because it leads to diversity of thoughts. And
Hmm.
diversity of thought is what will raise some of the bugs because they'll go, well, this doesn't make sense to me. Can you make sense to me? I've done this thing. The tests are taking this long. That's really long. And when I look into it, there's these like loading components that are taking too long. There's a bug, right? Or kind of this doesn't work in the way I'm anticipating, and when I write a test, like it doesn't have a nice flow. Like I can't make a nice flow. Like those are not necessarily automation bugs, but automation people find it because they've walked through the system to then create their automation.
Yeah.
And so they should be able to do kind of not necessarily like be a CSS guru or JavaScript guru, but it's kind of like I need to make these changes. I understand the changes I'm making. This makes everything more testable, and
Yeah. I
then
like you.
everyone wins at that point.
Yeah, I like you touched about testability because this is something that it's very important, right? Writing the code in a way that it makes it easier to test will be beneficial for everyone developing it. But I was wondering also if you would have any advice for because what I see is that many times we see people doing just automation, not because let's see how I can say it. Not because they don't want to do more stuff, but because the industry is telling them, in quotes, that this is what they should focus on. Like what I'm trying to say is like many times we see people coming from manual testing to test automation because of the demand growing so much into test automation, but you are actually not ready to be doing automation because you are coming from a background where you don't have that much technical background, programming background. As you said in the beginning, test automation is software development. You are writing code. So do you have any advice for these people to grow in terms of like writing robust tests and going beyond that on adding testability in the application they are touching and they are testing and that kind of stuff?
Um, so like I'm a like weirdly people I say this like people find this weird. Like I'm a big fan of record and replay as a
Hmm.
gate, like, and I can't think of a better term, but I see it as like a gateway drug, right? It gets you started in automation.
Hmm.
Now, if you have all those tests like recorded, like the one thing that generally happens in software development is that you have like a mishmash of code, and then you go, actually, I see a lot of duplication. Let me refactor that, right? And
Yeah.
that's where kind of being able to like learn to program for people is getting that confidence into, hey, let me refactor this, because if I refactor this, I improve maintainability of my
Hmm.
tests.
Yeah.
And then you go, okay, cool. And then suddenly you notice that tests are failing, and it's like, well, what change happened, right? And I think it's important for like QA folks to be able to um, start to understand what a diff looks like, right? Like a change was made, I can look at it, I can see this line was removed and this line was added, and because of this thing, my test started failing. Let's
Hmm.
understand what that is doing, right? And I don't think they need to go too deep, but every time they hit
Hmm.
those situations, just like try break down the system to go, oh, actually, I have this. And it's all about gaining confidence in the system that they're in, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like from there, they can go like, I've recorded everything, I've got code now. I've tried to make it maintainable through like page objects or things like that, right? Like we can use those things, but page objects are essentially just refactoring code into different methods and different objects. And then you go from there to your test and you see how things go. And it's just a cycle of going through that. I know that like different languages have different um, tools for people to learn how to do the languages.
Hmm.
And I do recommend people do that because it's just a good way of learning to do it. But the focus, like, is coming from a manual to automation, is doing that. But also at the same time, not everyone is cut out to be a software developer,
Yeah.
right? In the same way that not everyone's cut out to be an exploratory tester. I
Hmm.
know some really good exploratory testers who can look at code, read it, but if you ask them to code, they wouldn't be able to do it. But they're
Hmm.
fantastic people at finding bugs, like nuances in the code that need fixing, and
Yeah.
surfacing that to people. And so it's like we don't need everyone to be automation people. We
Hmm.
don't need everyone to be software developers. What we need is a breadth of people to kind of
Yeah.
make high quality code.
Yeah. I like you touched on refactoring as well, and I think this is a very important point you just brought. But I wanted to touch on the refactoring part, specifically when talking about record and playback. I don't remember if it was in a video I recorded for my YouTube channel or in a course where I was teaching this record and playback Cypress functionality, where I teach exactly like you do record, you get some code and you refactor it afterwards, like because you want it to to be maintainable afterwards. But another point that I wanted to add is if you are coming from manual testing and you were using record and playback to write your first piece of code, you might not even know how to refactor it, although you see there are lots of duplications. So, what I encourage people to do in such cases is to pair with someone else who has more experience than you to teach you the ways of refactoring. So when you reach that point again, you know more or less what to do. I'm saying this by experience. When I was in the beginning of my career in test automation, I didn't know. I heard about refactoring, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know how to do it. And if there, and even after I kind of got what it was, I wasn't able to do it myself until I sat down with someone that had more experience than me. And this person told me, let's do some refactoring. And then I was just sitting beside him and watching and looking into him, removing some pieces of code, extracting two functions, and then using those functions. And then things start to click. So I think this could be like a good way to be able to improve in your technical skills if that's what you want. Do you have anything to add in that sense?
Yeah, so like if you do that, if you have a kind of a colleague who's really good at kind of being able to teach and do things, like I like pair programming. I don't always do it, but I do like it. The other thing is that open source communities are really good, right? Like not everyone in those communities is there because they want to scratch an itch, and some of it could be like, hey, I want to learn to code and I've picked this project and I'm going to fix these little bugs and hopefully learn to code. And you'll get great advice through those things. And because they like no one there is about trying to put people down. Like
Yeah.
this is one of the reasons why I've been in the Selenium community for 15 years. Like I've like through our like IRC back in the day, but like Slack and things like that nowadays, there are people who teach other people how to code for interviews in the Slack and go like, this is what you do, this is how you set that, this is how you do it.
Yeah.
And it's the community that keeps me going for those things, right? Like I think it's really important because like everyone wants everyone to succeed.
Yeah, I gave a talk a while ago where I was talking about some of the learnings I had while I worked at whereby.com back then when I was living in Norway. And I remember telling that one of the learnings was that code review was a very good way to teach others and also to learn from others. And I think this is a very good point when you contribute to open source. You submit your change to a code base that already exists, and you ask for review, and people will give you feedback that will allow you to make the code better, but not only to make the code better, to make you a better professional, because you learn new things that you can apply next time, right? So
Yeah.
and since we talked about open source, the final question that I have for you here is, could you tell us a bit about your history with open source? You touched a bit on it, but I wanted to hear more about it. So, which contributions in terms of programming languages? Well, Selenium you have already mentioned. You contributed to Python and JavaScript, but tell us a little bit more about like how did you start contributing to open source? What was the reason, and whatever comes to your mind.
So so I grew up in South Africa, and when I first moved to the UK, I got work at a bank, and because I'd studied industrial psychology and computer science because I couldn't decide what I wanted to be, but I really liked
You
people.
studied both of them?
Yeah,
Nice.
I really like people, but I also like seeing how people and computers and everything interact with each other, right? Like that was my kind of main goal. Except like at the end of my degree, I really hated my computer science professor. And so kind of came over to the UK and I got work at a bank, and then like they said, oh, like because I saw one guy was programming Windrunner. So for kind of people who are young and don't know what Windrunner was, it was a paid automation tool for multiple systems, and so they were doing Windrunner. And so the joke is that Windrunner was created by a company called Mercury. Selenium was created as a tool to combat mercury, like because you take selenium if you have mercury poisoning. So that's where the name Selenium came from. And so kind of I
That's
then got
very
a
nice to know.
yeah.
I remember Mercury. Yeah.
Yeah, so then I got a job at a startup after the bank, and they were like, I I had to create their whole QA department, and so they're like, we need to make things faster, things like that. And this was kind of just at the time when CIs were becoming a thing,
Mm.
and like Selenium was just burgeon, like just being created, and so it's I kind of was like, oh, I'll help out on the forums. And like one nice thing for the open source community is my wife is a musician. So like for half the week, in the evening, she's away. And so I was like, oh, I get to program, I get to do this. And this was fun for me. And so that's how I got started. And then I got I was doing a lot in the Selenium space, and then I got an offer to write a book in Selenium. I did it. Then I got a job offer from Mozilla to kind of work on Selenium stuff at Mozilla and improve kind of how that is. And so it's kind of been that arc of like test automation that I've worked on. So I've done a bit of work on like Jasmine back in the day, Selenium. I've worked on like PyTest. I've done patches for PyTest and kind of helped out on those things. Created like PyTest plugins. Worked on like Firefox, Gecko driver, Mozilla's internal CI/CD tooling at different levels. It's kind of changed over the years. I think the last one I worked on was one called Task Cluster, which created a cluster of infrastructure in the cloud for you. So you could just like give it a YAML file and it would just like go off and generate all the kind of necessary machines and then pull code and do all of that. So that was cool. And yeah, like I've kind of gone through that space, and so I've done multiple languages from like I said, Python and JavaScript. The way I got into the Selenium project at the time is that I was helping mostly at the time working on .NET and C# implementations. So I've done that. Done a bit of like when I was at Mozilla, because Mozilla's everything's open source. So I was working in C++, Python, did a bit of Rust, lots of JavaScript. And then I've just kind of gone through it all.
And out of curiosity, how much do you think being so deep inside open source have helped you in your career in general? Because like I read last year, the Cathedral and the Bazaar, which talks about the open source movement, and I think we have so much to learn from open source. So, how much do you think being inside open source projects have helped you grow in your career and be a better professional and all that stuff?
So, first and foremost, right, like I've been incredibly lucky that, like, for the last 14 years, I've been paid to work on open source, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so I see that as a great honor that I've got this lucky. I think everyone should treat all their projects like it was open source. It doesn't need to be open source.
I loved it.
But for the main reason is that, like, when you work on open source, because everything is in the open, you have to have a slightly different mentality. So, like, you know that anyone can look at your code. And so there's that thing. And so you get, like, at the beginning, you like get really anxious about doing it. And then after a while, you're like, it's just code, right? And then you learn that all code is mutable, right? You can always change it, right?
Yeah.
So that's fine. And so you get into this thing about, like, I'm going to fix the problem, but the way I design contracts, APIs, whatever, right? Where the way I design contracts is that they need to last forever. So you try to put a focus on what the contract looks like, not what the code looks like. And suddenly that changes, I think, a bunch of mentality for a lot of people. The other side of it is that if you treat everything like an open source project, you don't do silly things like putting secrets into your repositories.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So many people do it, and then they get into open source, and then, like, large companies who never do open source, they like, oh, actually, let's do this open source thing. And it's like, oh, by the way, you've left your key file in your repository, and there's huge stories of, like, companies whose extension, like, people are writing extensions
I find
and
it
signing it
funny.
as another company.
Yeah, I find it funny because people think, "Oh, my repository is private; it's fine." But if a hacker gets into it, it will get your credentials and everything. So this is something I always teach my students: not track your sensitive data.
Yeah, it's and, like, you have to have slightly better hygiene in the way you develop, store, share things, right?
Yeah.
But
What
generally, if
about?
you, yeah,
Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, but generally, if you do all of those things, you have slightly more secure infrastructure
Yeah.
always. So,
Yeah. And what about communication skills? Do you think open source helped you with asynchronous communication, that kind of thing? Because it's something that to me, it helped me a lot. I also had the chance to be paid to work for an open source project while I worked for GitLab. and I learned so much about async communication. So I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about this as well.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this was down to open source or if this was just down to working at Mozilla, because Mozilla had a
Mm.
fantastic remote culture. So
Hmm.
when I joined in like 2010, and when I joined, there was like only 350 of us. But by design, everything was like you put things in a wiki, you kind of like IRC is there, but don't assume the person is there, right? You've got to do these things. And so there was that great culture that I just got used to, and now I do it everywhere. And so, like, when I joined Browser Stack, um, they were not a remote first company, but I joined like yesterday was my 4 year anniversary. So literally kind of
Congrats.
2 3 weeks before most of the world went into lockdown with COVID, right? And when we went into lockdown, the company went remote. They're mostly based in India, which was kind of a shock for a lot of people.
Hmm.
Um, and then like after a while, like because India had a really bad time when it came to COVID. And so they got to a point they were like, actually, you know what? It just makes sense. We've got used to everything being remote. Why don't we become a remote first company? Right. Which is
Hmm.
super rare in India. And now they've maintained it. And so it's been a lot of learning for a lot of people to become remote first, where for me, it's just like if I send you a message on Slack, I know when I get the response is when I get the response. It's not
Yeah.
before or not, like it's then.
You don't
And
expect it to be immediately responded.
no, exactly. And if I send you an email, I send you an email, right? And but I've also got like really good because of my position in the company. I also know that some people get very nervous about it. So kind of I use facilities of like scheduling Slack messages so that like if I do get an idea at say 10 o'clock at my for me, which is like 3:30 in the morning in India, if I need to message someone, that they're not going to get a ping, right? Like I'll make sure that it arrives to their computer at 9 o'clock in the morning for them,
Mm.
and then they can respond whenever like they get to it. And so I've got into that. So I'm not sure if it's open source, but there is a lot of that in open source that you need to be better at asynchronous communication because the person you're speaking to could literally be 12 hours ahead or behind you.
Yeah, that's really awesome. David, thank you so much for being here and sharing your story with us. Is there anything that you would like to ask me or share, or any final message to our audience in here?
Um, I think the last message that I really like to share is that if you're using open source tooling and things like that, just drop those people working on that tool a message to say thank you. It will make their day, their month, their year, and it makes a big difference to people to know that like it's making like what they're working on is making a difference to you. So that's my big one.
So before I end, I'm gonna thank you because you are a contributor of open source. So I hope I can make your day as well. And I'm gonna thank you that are watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, uh, also share this video with others that can benefit from watching it. And I talk to you next time. Thank you, David.
Thank you.